The rain came in sheets, not as water but as a liquid wall moving across the plains of West Texas. It was a biblical deluge, the kind that scoured the earth and reminded a man of his insignificance. For Caleb Thornfield, sitting on the covered porch of his cabin, the storm was just noise, a familiar and welcome symphony of isolation. It was the sound of the world being kept at bay. For 15 years, the world had been an enemy, and this ranch, this hard-scrabble patch of dirt and rock, was his fortress. He swirled the amber whiskey in his glass, the cheap burn a familiar friend. The wind clawed at the eaves of the cabin, a hungry animal trying to find a way in, but the structure, like the man who built it, was resolute. It was made of thick, hand-hewn timbers, settled deep into the earth, designed to withstand anything the sky or man could throw at it. Caleb was a man carved from the same material as the landscape around him, grizzled, weathered, all hard lines and sharp angles. At 42, his face was a roadmap of sun and sorrow, his eyes the color of a washed-out winter sky, holding a deep and abiding caution. A thick, unkempt beard, more salt than pepper, obscured a jaw set in a permanent state of defiance. He had rules, forged in the fire of a long-ago betrayal that had seared his soul and taught him the one lesson he'd carried into the wilderness. Solitude is safety. People were the variable, the unpredictable storm that could wreck a life without warning. His rules were simple. Rule 1, mind your own business. Rule 2, expect nothing from anyone. Rule 3, the most important, never, ever let anyone inside the gate. For a decade and a half, these rules had kept him sane. They had kept him alive. The rhythm of his life was as predictable as the sunrise. He tended his few dozen head of cattle, mended fences that bordered nothing but more emptiness, and spoke only to his old horse, Thunder, a beast as gray and steady as himself. Thunder was a living relic of a different time, a link to the younger, wilder man Caleb had been before the world had broken him. The horse held no judgment, made no demands. It was a perfect companionship. Tonight, the whiskey and the storm were his other companions. He watched the lightning split the bruised purple sky, each jagged spear illuminating a landscape of soaked mesquite, an endless, rolling emptiness. It was a brutal sort of beauty, and it was his. He owned the solitude, cherished the numbness. It was a hard-won peace, a truce with his own ghosts. Then he saw it. A flicker at the edge of his vision, down by the main gate a quarter-mile away. It was a shape, indistinct in the downpour, struggling against the wind. He squinted, leaning forward in his rocking chair, the wood groaning in protest. Animals didn't move like that. It was human. A cold knot tightened in his gut. A stranger. Here. Rule 3 screamed in his mind, a klaxon of warning. Not your problem. He took a swig of whiskey, the fire doing nothing to warm the chill that had seeped into his bones. He had a reputation in the nearest town, a place he visited twice a year for supplies. They called him the Hermit of Black Creek Ridge. They knew to leave him be. No one came out this far. No one. The figure stumbled, fell to its knees in the mud, then rose again, staggering toward the gate. It was a silhouette, genderless and desperate, a wraith born of the storm. Caleb's hand tightened on his glass. He could go inside, latch the door, douse the lamp, and wait for the problem to go away. Die, maybe. The thought was cold, pragmatic. Nature was cruel. He had learned to be the same, but something held him in his chair, a forgotten wire humming with a current he hadn't felt in years. It was the way the figure fell, a gesture of complete and utter surrender to the elements. He'd seen calves born in a late frost look that way, a fleeting moment of life before the cold took them. The figure reached the gate, a simple wooden barrier with a heavy chain and padlock. It clung to the bars, head bowed against the assault of wind and rain. Caleb could hear a faint, thin sound carried on the gale, a cry that was half whimper, half shout, swallowed by the roar of the storm. He stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the porch boards. His body felt stiff, unused to reacting to anything beyond his own volition. The instinct for self-preservation warred with a deeper, more ancient instinct, a protective morality he thought he had buried 15 years ago under layers of cynicism and scar tissue. "Damn it," he muttered, the word a plume of steam in the cool, damp air. He set his glass down on the railing with a sharp clink. The whiskey wouldn't help. This was a problem that required clarity. He watched for another minute, hoping the figure would turn back, be defeated, disappear back into the tempest from which it had emerged. But it didn't move, just sagged against the gate, a testament to the last dregs of human endurance. He was breaking his most important rule. He knew it as he pulled on his worn leather duster and settled his hat firmly on his head. He knew it as he stepped off the porch and into the maelstrom, the cold rain hitting him like a physical blow. The mud sucked at his boots with each step, a greedy, cloying embrace. The fortress was being breached, not by force, but by a plea. And the most damnable part of it all was that he was the one unlocking the door. As he trudged through the driving rain, the distant figure became clearer. It was small, slender, a woman. And that somehow made it worse. A woman was a complication of a different magnitude, a harbinger of the very chaos he had fled. The flicker of forgotten empathy he'd felt on the porch was now a roaring bonfire of internal conflict. His solitude was no longer safe. It was under siege. By the time he reached the gate, she had collapsed entirely, a heap of soaked fabric and exhaustion in the churning mud. He fumbled with the key to the padlock, his fingers stiff and clumsy from the cold and disuse. The chain fell away with a heavy clank, and he swung the gate open. He knelt, his knee sinking into the mire. He turned her over gently. She was young, barely a woman, 19, maybe 20. Her face was pale as death, framed by strands of dark, plastered hair. But it was the other marks that made his breath catch. A ugly purple bruise bloomed on her cheekbone, and her lip was split and swollen. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and wide with a terror so profound it seemed bottomless. They weren't just the eyes of someone lost in a storm. They were the eyes of a hunted animal. "Please," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing, barely audible over the wind. "He's coming." Caleb's jaw tightened. He had just wanted to send her on her way, point her toward a town that wasn't his problem, but looking down at her, at the raw evidence of a violence that had nothing to do with the weather, he knew it wasn't going to be that simple. He had let the storm in, and he had a sinking feeling it was a storm of men, not clouds. Without a word, he scooped her up. She was lighter than a feed sack, all sharp bones and trembling fear. As he carried her back toward the cabin, toward the light and the warmth and the breaking of all his rules, he felt the fragile peace of his 15-year exile shattering like glass around him. He wasn't just carrying a woman. He was carrying the world he had abandoned and all its attendant pain right back over his threshold. He laid her on the worn sheepskin rug in front of the stone hearth, where the embers of a morning fire still glowed faintly. He stoked them, adding kindling and then a split log, until a hesitant flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows across the room. The cabin was a single large space, meticulously organized for a solitary existence. A bed in one corner, a small kitchen in another, a table with a single chair. It was a monk's cell, a bastion of order against the chaos outside, and now she was in the middle of it, a disruption of color and pain and fear. He fetched a thick wool blanket and draped it over her, then went to the kitchen area and put a kettle on the hook over the fire. He moved with an economy of motion born of long practice, his silence a heavy presence in the room. He didn't know what to say. The language of comfort was foreign to him, a tongue he hadn't spoken in 15 years. He could dress a wound, set a bone, shoot a predator, but he didn't know how to soothe a terror he couldn't see. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing as she moved. The blanket pooled around her waist. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, now soaked and torn and clinging to her thin frame. The lamplight was unforgiving. It showed the dark circles under her eyes, the fading yellow of an older bruise on her jaw, the way her hands trembled as she clutched the blanket to her chest. Her eyes, though, held something other than fear. Beneath the exhaustion and the desperation, there was a spark, a hard, defiant light that refused to be extinguished. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now, though still raspy. Caleb grunted in response, pouring hot water into a mug with some tea leaves. He set it on the floor beside her, careful not to get too close. "Drink it." She took the mug in both hands, letting the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. She took a small, hesitant sip. Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the Spartan neatness, the rack of rifles on the wall, the solitude etched into the very grain of the wood. "Where am I?" "My land," he said, his tone flat, discouraging further questions. He stood by the hearth, a sentinel in his own home, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a wall of a man, and he wanted her to feel it. He wanted her to understand that this was a temporary shelter, not a sanctuary. "He'll be looking for me," she said, her gaze dropping to the tea. "He won't stop." "Who's he?" Caleb asked. Though he already had a sick feeling, he knew the kind of man she was talking about. She hesitated, her knuckles white around the mug. "My husband." The word hung in the air, ugly and possessive. Caleb's expression didn't change, but inside a cold anger stirred. He had seen men like that before, men who believed ownership extended to flesh and blood. It was the kind of thinking that had driven him out here in the first place, the casual cruelty of the powerful. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mercy," she said, a faint, bitter irony in her voice. "Mercy Whitfield." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his impassive face. He'll have men with him. He always does. Caleb felt the world shrinking, the vast Texas wilderness suddenly feeling small and crowded. This was more than a domestic dispute. This was organized, a hunt. And his name? She swallowed hard, as if the name itself was poison. Silas Hartwell. The name dropped into the quiet cabin like a stone into a deep well. Hartwell. Caleb knew that name. Everyone in this part of Texas knew that name. The Hartwells weren't just wealthy, they were a dynasty. They owned half the county, the land, the water rights, the sheriff, the judges. They operated under a different set of rules, the kind that were written in money and enforced with blood. Silas Hartwell was the heir, known for his polished smile and a temper as violent and unpredictable as a summer hailstorm. To cross a Hartwell was to invite ruin. To shelter someone a Hartwell was hunting. That was suicide. Caleb turned away from her and walked to the single window, peering out into the black, rain-lashed night. The fragile illusion of his fortress had been comical. His fences, his gate, his isolation, they were nothing against the kind of power that could buy the law and command a private army. He had fled the world of men, but the world of men had followed him, riding on the back of the storm. "You brought a war to my door, girl," he said, his voice low and gravelly. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. He heard her set the mug down. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know where else to go. I just ran." He could feel her eyes on his back. He was supposed to tell her to leave, to give her some food, maybe a dry coat, and send her back out into the night. It was the smart thing to do. It was the only way to preserve the life he had so carefully constructed. He could still lock the door, douse the light, and pretend she had never been there. The Hartwells would find her eventually, and it would be over. Not his problem. But he thought of the bruises on her face, the abject terror in her eyes when she'd first seen him. He thought of the name, Hartwell, and the casual tyranny it represented. The part of him he thought was dead. The part that believed in right and wrong was stirring. It was an old, aching pain, like a poorly set bone nagging him on a cold day. The betrayal he'd suffered had been about money and trust, a clean cut compared to this. This was foul. This was a wolf hunting a lamb. He turned back from the window. Her gaze was steady on him, that defiant spark burning brighter now. She wasn't just begging for help. She was challenging him. She was asking him what kind of man he was, The kind who hid, or the kind who stood for something. For 15 years he had been the first. He didn't know if he could be the second. "You can stay till the storm breaks," he said, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "Then you move on." It was a compromise. A lie, he told himself. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that another storm was coming, and it wouldn't be broken by the dawn. It would break right here, on his land, against the walls of his cabin. And he had just invited it in. He gave her his bed, a simple cot in the corner, and took the sheepskin rug by the fire for himself. He lay there for hours, his rifle within arm's reach, listening to the twin rhythms of the storm outside and her quiet, troubled breathing inside. Sleep was a country he couldn't reach. His mind, usually a quiet and ordered place, was a maelstrom of old ghosts and new fears. The face of the man who had betrayed him, a partner he'd trusted like a brother, flickered in the firelight, morphing into the unseen face of Silas Hartwell. The lie had been different, a matter of forged signatures and stolen futures, but the underlying principle was the same, the strong preying on the trusting. He had responded by becoming a fortress. He had walled himself off so no one could ever get close enough to hurt him again. But the girl, Mercy, had slipped through his defenses without even trying. Her vulnerability was a weapon he had no shield against. He found himself listening to the cadence of her breath, a fragile sound in the vast, roaring silence of his life. He was angry at her for being here, for bringing her trouble to his door. But he was angrier at the man who had put the fear in her eyes, angrier at a world that allowed such men to thrive. Sometime before dawn, the rain softened to a drizzle, and the wind died to a mournful sigh. The world outside was shrouded in a thick gray mist. He rose silently, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. He moved to the window, scanning the landscape. Nothing. Just the dripping trees and the sodden earth. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe Hartwell hadn't tracked her here. A fool's hope, and he knew it. She stirred when the smell of coffee filled the small cabin. She sat up, clutching the blanket, her eyes less haunted this morning, but wary. "Did they—" "No," he cut her off. "Not yet." He handed her a cup of coffee, black and strong. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt went through him, an unwelcome spark of simple human contact. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He watched as she drank, her gaze fixed on the fire. In the morning light, he could see the fainter, yellowish remnants of older injuries on her arms. This wasn't a single event, it was a history, written on her skin. "Why here?" he asked, his voice rough. "This is the middle of nowhere." "That's why," she replied, not looking at him. "I stole one of his horses. I just rode. I didn't know where I was going, just away. The horse went lame a few miles back. I saw the smoke from your chimney." She finally looked at him. It was the only sign of life I'd seen in a day. A single column of smoke, the beacon that had doomed him. He had been so sure of his invisibility, he'd grown careless. "He told everyone I was unwell," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "That I was fragile, prone to hysterics. He has doctors who say so. He buys them, like he buys everything. So when he finds me, he'll tell them I ran off in a fit, that I'm a danger to myself." She looked down at her bruised hands. "No one ever questions him." Caleb knew the type. Silas would use her supposed instability to discredit her, to paint her as the villain in her own story. It was a classic, cruel tactic of the powerful abuser. "What happened? The final thing that made you run?" She was silent for a long moment, tracing the rim of her cup. When she spoke, her voice was a dead, flat monotone. "I was pregnant." The air in the cabin grew heavy, thick with the unspoken. Caleb didn't move, didn't breathe. He was angry about something, some deal that went sour. He came home drunk. He has a way of punishing me for things that have nothing to do with me. She took a shaky breath. "I lost the baby. After that, there was nothing left to stay for. There was nothing left in me but the running." The cold anger in Caleb's gut turned to ice. He looked at this young woman, this girl who had lost a child, who had been systematically broken and brutalized, and who had still found the strength to flee. Her resilience was a thing of terrifying beauty. He thought of his own retreat from the world. He had run from a financial betrayal, a wound to his pride and his wallet. She was running from a wound to her very soul. He heard it before he saw it. A low thrumming, the sound of engines where there should be none. He went to the door, opened it a crack, and peered out. Through the thinning mist, far down the track that led to his gate, he saw them. 2 dark modern trucks, their headlights cutting through the gray morning like the eyes of predators. They were coming. "They're here," he said, his voice grim. He turned back to her. Her face was a mask of stark terror. All the color had drained from it, and she was clutching the blanket so tightly her knuckles were bone white. "Go to the root cellar," he commanded, his voice sharp, leaving no room for argument. "The door is under the rug. Stay there. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" She just stared at him, paralyzed. "Do you understand?" he repeated, stepping toward her and gripping her shoulder. The contact was meant to steady her, but it felt like he was holding a bird with a broken wing. She nodded, a jerky, spastic movement. He pulled the rug back, revealing a heavy wooden trapdoor with an iron ring. He lifted it, revealing a small, dark space that smelled of earth and damp. She scrambled down the short ladder without looking back, pulling the blanket with her. He shut the door over her, replaced the rug, and kicked some dirt over the edges to obscure the seams. Then he walked to the rifle rack. He took down his old Winchester, the one he trusted most. The metal was cool and solid in his hands. He checked the action, the movement smooth and familiar. He took a box of cartridges from a shelf and began methodically feeding them into the rifle. Each click was a punctuation mark, an end to a sentence 15 years long. His heart was hammering against his ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, clear purpose he hadn't felt since he was a young man. The fortress was about to be tested. The hermit of Black Creek Ridge was about to have visitors. He walked to the front door, levered around into the chamber, and waited. The trucks were getting closer. The war had arrived. The 2 trucks, gleaming black and splattered with mud, rolled to a stop 50 yards from the cabin. They were ostentatious machines, symbols of wealth and power that looked alien in the rugged landscape. Doors opened and several men climbed out. They were big men, dressed in practical ranch hand gear, but carrying themselves with the lazy arrogance of hired muscle. 2 of them, Caleb noted, looked alike. Brothers, probably. But his eyes were fixed on the man who emerged from the passenger side of the lead truck. He was tall and impeccably dressed, even here in the mud. He wore tailored trousers and a fine leather jacket that probably cost more than Caleb's entire herd of cattle. His hair was dark and perfectly coiffed, his face handsome in a sharp, predatory way. He moved with an unearned grace, a man accustomed to the world arranging itself for his convenience. This had to be Silas Hartwell. He didn't carry a weapon openly, but he didn't need to. The men around him were his weapons. Silas surveyed the cabin, his lips curling into a faint, condescending sneer. He took a step forward, his expensive boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. "Hello, the house!" he called out, his voice smooth and cultured, yet carrying an unmistakable edge of command. Caleb opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the Winchester held loosely at his side, its barrel pointed at the ground. He stood there, a silent, unmoving figure, letting them see him, letting them measure him. He didn't speak. Silence was his territory. Let them be the ones to break it. Silas smiled, a flash of white teeth that didn't reach his cold, dark eyes. "Well now, we seem to have found the local color. I am Silas Hartwell. I'm looking for my wife. She's a bit unwell. Wandered off last night in the storm. We've been tracking her horse. It went lame about a mile from here. Figured this was the only place she could have ended up." Caleb remained silent, his gaze flat and unreadable. He let Hartwell's words hang in the damp air. Unwell, wandered off. The narrative was already being woven, the lie already being told. Silas's smile tightened a fraction. He was not a man used to being ignored. She's a fragile thing, beautiful, but prone to fits of fancy, delusions. Sometimes she doesn't know what she's doing. You haven't seen her, have you? Small dark hair, pretty, but with a haunted look in her eyes? Caleb's thumb rested on the hammer of the Winchester. The description was accurate, but coated in a layer of patronizing poison. He's painting her as a madwoman before he even asks the question. Haven't seen anyone, Caleb said, his voice a low rumble, the first words he'd spoken. Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. I find that hard to believe. This is the only shelter for 20 miles. Now I don't want any trouble. My wife is a sick woman. She needs her medicine. She needs to be back home where she can be cared for. I'm sure you understand. He took another step forward, his men fanning out slightly behind him. It was a subtle, predatory shift, like a pack of wolves encircling their prey. I understand you're on my land, Caleb said, his voice still level. And I understand you're not welcome here. A flicker of annoyance crossed Silas's perfect face. He dropped the pretense of politeness. Look, old man, I don't have time for your backwoods posturing. My wife is here. I know she's here. She stole from me, ran off, and she's probably filled your head with all sorts of hysterical lies. But let me tell you the truth. He paused, letting the silence stretch, his eyes locking with Caleb's. This was the moment, the psychological attack. My wife, Mercy. She's not just sick, she's dangerous. We were going to have a child. Silas's voice dropped, taking on a tone of manufactured grief. Our first, a son, and in one of her fits, she did something. An accident, she claimed, but the result was the same. She killed my son before he ever had a chance to draw breath. The lie was a masterpiece of cruelty, designed to twist a knife in the heart of any man with a shred of decency. But it was also aimed, with uncanny precision, at Caleb's own history of betrayal. Silas was betting that Caleb was a cynic, a man who believed the worst of people, a man who would believe a beautiful woman capable of terrible deception. He was trying to turn Caleb's own shield, his distrust, into a weapon against Mercy. Caleb felt a tremor go through him, a rage so cold and pure it felt like ice water flooding his veins. He thought of Mercy's dead, flat voice telling him about the baby. He thought of the bruises, the history of pain written on her skin. He looked at Silas Hartwell, at his handsome, lying face, his feigned sorrow, and he saw the very essence of the evil he had fled. A man who could beat his wife, cause the death of their unborn child, and then twist the story to paint himself as the victim and her as a manipulative murderer. It was a corruption so profound it defied reason. Silas saw the flicker in Caleb's eyes and mistook it for doubt. He pressed his advantage. She's a liar and a thief. Probably told you I beat her, didn't she? It's her favorite story. Anything to get sympathy. She's in there, isn't she? Let us come in, and we'll take her off your hands. I'll even compensate you for your trouble. He reached into his jacket, as if to pull out a wallet. This was the critical moment of choice. 15 years of solitude had been a preparation for this. It was a choice between his hard-won empty peace and a war he could not possibly win. It was a choice between believing the powerful, manipulative man and protecting the terrified, broken woman hiding under his floorboards. It was a choice between rule number 1, mind your own business, and the forgotten, aching law of his own conscience. For a split second he saw the easy path. Let them in. Let them take her. Go back to the silence, the whiskey, the numbness. His life could be his own again. But he knew it would be a different kind of silence then. It would be the silence of cowardice, the silence of complicity. The fortress would become a tomb. He looked past Silas, at the hired guns and the smug brothers, at the systemic force that protected abusers and preyed on the vulnerable. And he made his choice. It wasn't even a choice, really. It was a recognition of who he was. Not the hermit, not the victim of a long-ago betrayal, but the man who drew a line in the dirt. Caleb's hand moved. It wasn't fast, but it was deliberate, a single fluid motion. He raised the Winchester to his shoulder, the heavy stock settling into a place it knew well. The barrel came up, pointing not at Silas, but just to the side of his head, aimed at the lead truck's windshield. But the message was for Silas alone. The click of the hammer being cocked was deafening in the sudden stillness. Silas's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, venomous shock. His men tensed, hands moving toward their own weapons. "I believe her," Caleb said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of an irreversible decision. The words hung in the air, a declaration of war. He had just sided with the vulnerable stranger against overwhelming force. He had consciously, willingly, shattered his 15 years of isolation. He had chosen. "Get off my land," Caleb said, his eye sighting down the barrel of the rifle. "Now." For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. It was a standoff between two kinds of power, the power of money and guns, and the power of a single man on his own porch, defending a principle. Silas's face was a mask of incandescent fury. He had been denied. He, Silas Hartwell, had been told no by a grizzled nobody in the middle of nowhere. It was an insult he could not abide. "You have just made the biggest mistake of your life, old man," Silas hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. He took a slow step back, his eyes burning with a promise of retribution. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Caleb replied, his voice as cold and hard as the rifle in his hands. "You're a man who beats his wife, and you're standing on my property. That's all I need to know." Silas gestured curtly to his men. "Fine, have it your way." He backed away toward the truck, his movements stiff with rage. "You want to protect her? You can die with her." He climbed back into the truck, slammed the door, and the engine roared to life. The two trucks reversed, churning up the mud, and retreated back down the track, disappearing into the mist. They were gone. For now. Caleb lowered the rifle, but he didn't relax. His heart was pounding a frantic, exhilarating rhythm against his ribs. He felt more alive than he had in 15 years. The numbness was gone, burned away by the clean fire of defiance. He had made his stand. He had chosen his side. But he knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that this was just the beginning. The quiet standoff was over. The siege was about to begin. He looked out at the empty, misty landscape where the trucks had been, and he knew that Silas Hartwell would be back. And when he returned, he wouldn't be coming to talk. He would come to burn Caleb's world to the ground. Caleb turned and went back inside, bolting the heavy oak door. The silence in the cabin was different now. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the tense, humming silence before a battle. He moved the rug and lifted the trap door. Mercy was huddled at the bottom of the ladder, her face pale, her eyes wide. She had heard everything. "He's gone?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "For now," Caleb said. He extended a hand to help her up. She took it, her fingers cold as ice. As she climbed out of the cellar, she didn't let go. She stood before him, her eyes searching his face, no longer with fear, but with a dawning, incredulous hope. "You believed me," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "He made it easy," Caleb grunted, pulling his hand away, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gaze. He walked over to the windows, pulling the heavy shutters closed and bolting them from the inside, plunging the cabin into a dim, fire-lit gloom. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft behind him. "You don't know me. You could have given me to him. Your life would have gone back to normal." He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. "My life wasn't normal. It was empty, and some things are worth fighting for." He looked at her, at the bruises and the fear and the defiant spark that refused to die. "Your freedom is one of them." The words surprised him as much as they did her. He hadn't known he believed them until he said them. For the first time, she gave him a small, fragile smile. It was like seeing the first flower push through the frozen ground after a long winter. "My name is Mercy," she said again, as if reintroducing herself. "What's yours?" "Caleb," he said. The storm of rain had passed, But the real storm was gathering its strength just beyond the ridge. As dusk began to settle, painting the slivers of sky visible through the cracks in the shutters in shades of orange and blood red, they worked in a tense, purposeful silence. Caleb showed her how to load the spare rifles, a lever-action Marlin, and a heavy double-barreled shotgun. Her hands were clumsy at first, but she was a quick study, her movements becoming more certain with each cartridge she seated. There was a grim determination in her eyes that replaced the terror. She was no longer just a victim. She was preparing to be a combatant. Caleb barricaded the back door with a heavy wooden table and checked his ammunition, laying out boxes of cartridges on the remaining cleared surface. He felt a grim sense of irony. He had built this cabin to keep the world out, and now he was turning it into a fortress to fight the world off. Every action was an admission that his old life was over. The solitude was gone, replaced by a shared, dangerous purpose. "They'll wait for full dark," he said, his voice low. "They'll try to use the night to their advantage." He handed her the shotgun. The weapon was almost too big for her, but she took it, her knuckles white on the stock. "It kicks like a mule. Aim for the center of a man. You don't have to be precise. Just point and pull the trigger. Both triggers if you have to." She nodded, her expression stark in the flickering lamplight. "I've never shot a gun before." "There's a first time for everything," he said grimly. "Tonight's your night." They ate a cold meal of jerky and hardtack, the kind of food that required no fire and no attention. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind, which had begun to pick up again. Caleb stood by one of the shuttered windows, peering through a small peephole he'd drilled years ago. He watched the landscape dissolve into an inky, moonless black. "They're coming," he said, his voice calm. Far off, like malevolent fireflies, he saw them. Torches, a dozen or more, snaking their way up the track toward the cabin. They weren't trying to be quiet. This was about intimidation. It was a show of force, a pack of hyenas moving in for the kill. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered. Mercy flattened herself against the stone wall of the hearth, the shotgun held tight to her chest. Her breathing was fast but controlled. The fear was there, but so was the resolve. The torches surrounded the cabin, casting wild, dancing shadows that made the trees look like grasping monsters. Then, silence. They were waiting. Caleb knew the tactic. They were trying to unnerve them, to let the fear cook inside the small, dark space. Then Silas's voice cut through the night, amplified by the unnatural quiet. "Thornfield, you had your chance. I'm a reasonable man, but my patience is at an end. Send out my wife and I'll let you live. I'll even let you keep this miserable pile of sticks you call a home." Caleb didn't answer. He moved silently to a peephole on the other side of the cabin, tracking their positions. He counted 8 men, not including Silas, who stood just outside the ring of light, a silhouette of command. "Last chance, old man," Silas yelled, his voice laced with impatience. "Don't be a fool. You can't win." A rock crashed through one of the shuttered windows, a shower of glass tinkling onto the floor. Mercy flinched, but held her position. It was a test, a provocation. Caleb raised the Winchester, rested the barrel in the peephole, and took aim at a torch held by one of the Hartwell brothers. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle boomed in the confined space, the sound a definitive answer to Silas's demands. Outside, the torch exploded in a shower of sparks and fell to the ground, plunging that section of the perimeter into darkness. A man yelled in surprise and pain. All hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from all sides, a deafening cacophony of shots. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls of the cabin, sending splinters of wood flying. It was a chaotic, undisciplined fusillade meant to terrify and overwhelm. Caleb moved from peephole to peephole, never staying in one place for more than a moment, firing sparingly, making every shot count. He wasn't trying to kill them all, not yet. He was trying to keep them back, to show them that this would not be an easy fight. He saw a figure break from the trees, running low toward the porch. Caleb drew a bead and fired. The man grunted and stumbled, clutching his leg, and scrambled back into the darkness. Another man tried to follow, and Caleb's next shot kicked up a spray of mud right in front of him, sending him diving for cover. "They're trying to get close enough to set the fire," he yelled to Mercy over the din. "Watch the porch!" Mercy crawled to the front of the cabin, peering through a crack near the door. Her face was pale but set. She rested the heavy shotgun on a low stool, trying to steady it. The gunfire outside intensified. They were getting angry, frustrated. This wasn't the easy work they were paid for. Then, through the roar, Caleb heard a new sound, the crackle and hiss of fire. He smelled it a second later. Acrid smoke, the scent of kerosene. They had thrown Molotovs against the back wall. "The cabin's on fire!" Mercy cried out, her voice tight with panic. The smoke began to seep through the walls, thin gray tendrils snaking into the room. The heat intensified. The cabin, Caleb's sanctuary, his fortress against the world, was becoming a trap. His 15-year refuge was being turned into his tomb. "We have to get out of here," he said, his mind racing. "The barn. It's our only chance." The barn was 50 yards away, a dark expanse of mud and open ground between them and it. A suicide run. But staying here was certain death. "When I open the door, we run. Don't stop for anything, just run. Do you hear me?" he shouted, grabbing her arm. She nodded, her eyes wide, reflecting the flickering orange light that was beginning to glow through the chinks in the walls. "Stay behind me," he ordered. He unbolted the front door, took a deep breath, and kicked it open. The scene outside was a vision of hell. The night was lit by the growing fire that was now licking up the side of the cabin, the flames reflecting off the wet ground. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning pine. Gunshots immediately converged on the open doorway. Caleb fired the Winchester from the hip, providing covering fire as he plunged out into the night. "Now!" he yelled. Mercy burst out behind him, clutching the shotgun. They ran, slipping and sliding in the thick mud. Bullets whizzed past them, tearing through the air with angry hisses. Caleb fired again, and he saw a man near the woodpile go down. He didn't know if he was dead or wounded. He didn't care. They were halfway to the barn when a bullet caught him. It felt like a sledgehammer hitting his side, a fiery, tearing pain that stole his breath and sent him stumbling to one knee. He cried out, a sharp, involuntary gasp. Mercy turned, her face a mask of horror in the firelight. "Caleb! Go!" he roared, trying to get up, but his leg wouldn't cooperate. "Get to the barn!" Another figure emerged from the darkness to their left, one of the hired guns, his pistol raised. He was taking careful aim at Caleb's exposed back. There was no time for Caleb to turn, no time to raise his own rifle. This was it. But Mercy didn't run. In that split second, she stopped, planted her feet in the mud, and raised the heavy shotgun. She didn't seem to aim. It was a purely instinctual act, a desperate, defiant roar against the violence threatening to consume them. She pulled both triggers. The shotgun boomed, a deafening blast that lit up the night. The kick sent her staggering backward, but the cloud of buckshot hit the hired gun square in the chest, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the mud. He didn't move again. Mercy stood there for a second, trembling, the smoking shotgun hanging from her hands. Then she was at Caleb's side, grabbing his arm, hauling him up. "Come on!" she screamed, her voice raw. Leaning on her, his side a vortex of agony, they stumbled the last few yards to the barn and crashed through the wide doors, collapsing onto the hay-strewn floor. Caleb slammed the doors shut and dropped the heavy crossbar into place, just as bullets began to thud into the wood. They were safe. For a moment, the barn was vast and dark, smelling of hay and animals and earth. The only light came from the hellish orange glow of the burning cabin, filtering through the cracks in the walls. Caleb lay on the ground, gasping, pressing a hand to his side. It came away slick and hot with blood. Mercy was beside him instantly, tearing a strip of cloth from her dress. "Let me see," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She gently pushed his hand away. The bullet had gone clean through, a nasty flesh wound in his side, but it hadn't hit anything vital. It was bleeding badly, but he would live, if they survived the next hour. She wrapped the wound tightly, her touch surprisingly sure. The girl who had arrived broken and desperate was now a field medic, a soldier. She had just killed a man to save his life. The transformation was staggering. They could hear Silas screaming outside, enraged. "Burn it! Burn the whole damn place to the ground!" Caleb pushed himself into a sitting position, his back against a hay bale, his rifle across his lap. He looked at Mercy. In the flickering apocalyptic light, her face was streaked with soot and grime, but her eyes were clear and hard. The fear was gone, burned away and replaced by something cold and sharp. "You saved my life," he said, his voice raspy. "You saved mine first," she replied, picking up the shotgun and methodically reloading it, her hands no longer clumsy. They were a unit now, forged in fire, bound by blood. He had entrusted her with a weapon, and she had proven herself. More than proven herself. They heard the men moving around outside, splashing fuel against the barn walls. They were trapped. The fire that had destroyed Caleb's past was now coming for their future. "There's a loft!" Caleb gasped, pointing upward with his rifle. "We can get a better angle from there. It's our last stand." He struggled to his feet, leaning on Mercy for support. They climbed the rickety ladder to the hayloft, just as the first flames began to lick up the barn's outer walls. From their new vantage point, they could see the whole chaotic scene through a wide opening meant for loading hay. The cabin was now a roaring inferno, a funeral pyre for Caleb's old life. The hired guns were moving in, emboldened, thinking them trapped and helpless. "They're getting sloppy," Caleb muttered, resting the Winchester on a hay bale. "That's Silas's two brothers, coming from the right." He sighted on one of them and fired. The man cried out and fell. The other brother immediately dove for cover, firing blindly toward the loft. The remaining hired guns, seeing their employers go down and seeing the fight was far from over, had had enough. Caleb watched as two of them exchanged a look, then simply dropped their torches and melted back into the darkness of the plains. They were paid to be thugs, not to die in a war against a man who wouldn't quit, and a woman who had found her nerve. Silas, seeing his men deserting and one of his brothers wounded, let out a roar of pure fury. He was left with only his injured brother and one other loyal gunman. His plan was literally going up in smoke. In a fit of rage, he grabbed a torch himself and ran toward the main barn doors, intent on finishing it himself. "That's him," Mercy whispered, her voice a low, dangerous hum. She rested the shotgun on the edge of the loft opening, her aim steady. Caleb lined up a shot, but Silas was moving erratically, fueled by rage. Before Caleb could get a clear shot, the last of the gunmen stepped in front of Silas, laying down covering fire. Caleb took the shot he was given, and the gunman crumpled. Now it was just Silas. He stood alone in the flickering firelight, between the burning pyre of the cabin and the smoldering barn, a king with no kingdom, a predator with no pack. He looked up at the loft, his handsome face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He saw Mercy, aiming the shotgun directly at him. "You whore!" he screamed, his voice cracking with madness. "I'll drag you out of there myself!" He started for the barn doors again. This was the final confrontation. Not Caleb's, but hers. Caleb was wounded, his role as protector fulfilled. Now she had to become the agent of her own liberation. He saw the shift in her, the final hardening of her resolve. This was not about survival anymore. This was about retribution. This was about ending the cycle of fear. She let him get closer, her eyes never leaving him. The barn was starting to burn in earnest now, smoke filling the loft, the heat becoming unbearable. It was now or never. In the flickering light of his burning past, with Caleb at her side, Mercy leaned into the shotgun. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer running. She was the end of the story. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was the only sound in the world. It was a final, deafening judgment. Silas was thrown backward, his torch flying from his hand, his scream cut short. He landed in the mud and lay still. The tyrant was dead. His reign was over. And she was the one who had ended it. Silence fell, absolute and profound, broken only by the crackling of the flames. Mercy lowered the shotgun, her body trembling with the release of a tension she had carried for years. She looked at Caleb, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. A nod of respect, a nod of shared victory. The siege was over. In the quiet, smoky dawn, they stood amidst the ruins. The world was washed in pale shades of gray and pink, the air sharp with the smell of wet ash and pine. The cabin was a blackened, skeletal husk, its timbers still smoldering, sending lazy plumes of smoke into the morning sky. The barn was a collapsed heap, saved from complete destruction only by the dampness of the night. It was a scene of utter devastation, the physical manifestation of a life burned to the ground. Caleb stood leaning on a fence post, his side wrapped in a blood-stiffened bandage, a dull, throbbing ache his only companion. But as he looked at the wreckage of his fortress, he felt no sense of loss. The cabin had been his prison, its walls built of fear and regret. Watching it burn had been a kind of liberation. He had lost his solitude, but he had found something else, something he couldn't yet name. Mercy stood beside him, a rifle held loosely in her hand. She looked exhausted, bruised, and more beautiful than any woman he had ever seen. The haunted look in her eyes was gone. In its place was a quiet, weary strength, the look of a survivor who had not just endured, but conquered. They didn't speak for a long time, simply sharing the stillness, the shared experience too profound for words. The bodies of Silas and his men had been a grim task dealt with in the first light, dragged away from the immediate ruin, a final, stark punctuation to the violence of the night. Silas's remaining brother had fled with the wounded, leaving the dead behind like so much refuse. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice soft. "It's all gone." "Just the wood," Caleb said, his voice a low rasp. Nothing of value was lost. He looked at her, and in his gaze she understood. The cabin wasn't the value. The isolation wasn't the prize. It was just a place he had been hiding. She looked around at the vast, empty land stretching out to the horizon. "What will you do now?" It was a simple question, but it held the weight of everything. He could leave. He could take what little he had left and disappear, find another patch of nowhere to hide in. Or he could stay. He could face the ruins and the future they represented. "I'll rebuild," he said, the words surprising him with their certainty. He hadn't known it was his plan until he spoke it aloud. Mercy was quiet for a moment, her gaze on the horizon. The sun was cresting the ridge now, spilling golden light over the ravaged land, making the wet ash gleam. It was the light of a new day, a new beginning. "It's a lot of work for one man," she said, her voice still quiet, almost hesitant. Caleb turned his head to look at her fully. He saw the unspoken question in her eyes, the fragile hope she didn't dare voice. 15 years of his life had been governed by the rule to never let anyone in. He had broken that rule, and it had led to fire and blood and death. But it had also led to this moment, this quiet dawn, this shared peace that felt more real than any solitude he had ever known. He thought of the long years ahead, the silence, the emptiness. He could have it back if he wanted. All he had to do was say nothing, and she would leave. She would walk away, and he would be alone again, safe in his emotional fortress. But the thought of that silence now felt like a death sentence. "Maybe," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes finally meeting his. "Maybe I'd stay, help you rebuild." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a declaration. It was an offer, a foundation stone laid in the ashes of their shared ordeal, a chance to build something new not just from timber and nails, but from mutual respect and hard-earned trust. Caleb held her gaze, and for the first time in 15 years, he let someone see past the walls, past the scars, all the way to the man he had forgotten he could be. He gave a slow, small nod. It was all the answer she needed, a quiet, mutual understanding that was stronger than any vow. 6 months later, a new house stood on the rise, not far from the charred footprint of the old cabin. It was larger than the first, with more windows, wide windows that weren't meant to be shuttered, but to let the vast Texas light pour in. The timbers were new and clean, smelling of fresh-cut pine and promise. The porch was wider, with 2 rocking chairs sitting side by side, waiting for the evening cool. The land was healing. New grass was pushing up through the scorched earth, and the scars of the fight were slowly being erased by time and the turning of the seasons. Caleb's cattle grazed peacefully on a distant slope, and Thunder, the old horse, stood contentedly in a newly built corral next to a spirited mare Mercy had bought in town, a down payment on a future. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, Caleb and Mercy sat on the porch. He was cleaning his Winchester, the familiar, methodical movements a comfort, not a preparation. His side had healed into a puckered scar, a permanent reminder of the night he had chosen to fight. Mercy was mending a tear in one of his old shirts, her stitches small and neat. Her own scars, the ones on her skin, had faded to faint white lines, and the ones behind her eyes were gone completely. They were replaced by a calm, steady light. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They had spent the last months in a rhythm of shared work, rebuilding not just a home, but a life. They had learned each other's silences, the comfortable quiet that exists only between 2 people who have been to hell and back together. His grizzled caution had softened, and her fragile strength had solidified into a core of unshakable confidence. He finished cleaning the rifle and set it aside, leaning back in his chair with a soft sigh of contentment. He looked out at the endless sky, painted in hues of soft pink and deep purple. He had lived in this place for over 15 years, but he was seeing it for the first time. He had thought this landscape was the definition of loneliness. Now, he knew it was the definition of peace. Mercy finished her sewing, folded the shirt, and set it on the small table between them. She followed his gaze to the horizon. The silence on the porch was no longer the silence of wary, self-imposed isolation. It was the silence of shared, peaceful companionship. It was the sound of home. It was the sound of a trust that had not been given but built. One splinter, one scar, and one shared sunset at a time. And it was more than enough.